And welcome back. Our first segment of our show this morning, as we've mentioned prior to the commercial break, is to discuss with the Public Service Union, the representatives of the P.S.U, the Grievance Manual, and of course, we're also going to be touching on the topic that we've been following for the past week, which has to do with the public officer who has been placed on leave. That being said, however, we have with us in studio this morning the Legal Counsel for the Public Service Union, Jackeline Willoughby. Good morning.
Good morning.
We also have with us the Industry Relations Officer, Calbert Barber.
Morning.
Good morning, folks. Good morning. So let's begin first of all with the hot button issue that everyone has been following for the past few days, and this has to do with the actions that have been taken in the wake of a phone call that a public officer received while on duty last weekend with the importation of plants into the country, and of course what took place between that individual and the Prime Minister from whom the call came. From your perspective as a legal mind and as someone who has been in the Public Service Union for all these many years, share with us, Jackie, your position on this incident, the way it's been handled.
Let me correct you first of all.
Sure.
I'm not the legal counsel for the union.
Okay.
I'm a paying union member, has been for 33 years,
Okay.
and I'm a trade unionist at heart. So I sit here in this chair today, not necessarily as a legal counsel, I do sit here as a trade unionist and a member of the Public Service Union. I do not have the full details because I have not read the file, but of the little that I could have heard from what the Prime Minister said on television, I find that it was really bashful for the Prime Minister to have gotten on television and speak about calling a public officer. With the greatest of respect, he's not an accounting officer. In accordance with the Constitution, the accounting officer for the ministry is the CEO. It simply meant that if the PM wanted to advance, here Mr. Mai, wanted to advance any instructions, it would have had to be advanced to the CEO, who would have advanced it to the director or their HOD, and then to the officer's supervisor, and then to the officer. This is what is so wrong in the public service. Every government that has come in has used the public service as their toy and determined that when they can't get what they want done, they would manipulate and bulldoze public officers. What has happened to Mr. Chi is a travesty, and this union will ensure to stand by his side to make sure that he is not penalized for doing his job, because that's the other thing that's irritating. There is statutes that govern how plants enter this country. There are statutes. What the PM effectively did and what Minister Mai effectively did was to call Mr. Chi to ask him not to do his job. That is a travesty. Political minds need to understand they are the policy and lawmakers. It is the executive that implements these laws. Mr. Chi has a supervisor. Mr. Chi should not be receiving a phone call from neither the Prime Minister or any Minister of Cabinet. As a matter of course, if you look into our regulations, it is an offense for an officer to even approach a minister. So why should it be okay for them to call you and tell you not to do your job?
That's interesting. Let me come back a bit though, because the devil is in the details here. And what I want to know is, was this issue raised to the Public Service Union before it was publicized in the media?
That would be a question for Mr. Barber.
No, it wasn't.
So Mr. Chi never filed any complaint or expressed concern?
No. The matter came to our attention because of the interview the Prime Minister did with the media. Mr. Chi didn't approach us until he got that letter that put him on administrative leave. As Ms. Willoughby was implying, there were so many things that they did wrong. The words of the Prime Minister when he said he would contact the minister to deal with this, essentially saying that I'm going to punish you. that's trying to put fear in the public officers. Further to that, this letter that prompted Mr. Chi to come to us was, if you read it based on the letter itself, it was a punitive measure instead of an investigative measure. And you only could put a public officer on administrative leave for the purpose of an investigation. Now, this matter is a minor misconduct within our regulations.
So let's stop there. So two things that you're saying. One, that administrative leave can be used but for a specific function. But let's go back to what you are saying here, that it is in fact misconduct. Under what grounds?
I'm not saying he committed a misconduct. What they're accusing him of is only a minor misconduct.
What is the accusation?
It's, I think, under 41(2)(b, something to the effect that in the manner how you treat the public, you must treat them with respect.
In this case, he's alleged to have hung up the phone on the Prime Minister.
So you were unprofessional in some way. I'm using words to try to help our viewers understand.
Technically, that's what they're accusing him of. However, the fact of the matter is, this gentleman didn't even have a phone in his hand. He couldn't have. How did the call got disconnected? He don't know. It wasn't his phone that the Prime Minister called. Yes, he had a brief conversation with the Prime Minister to tell him follow protocol, follow the rules. But for the Prime Minister to blatantly accuse him of a misconduct or being rude by hanging up the phone, it's totally unfair to the public officer.
We're working on assumptions here that that is the basis of the misconduct. But Jackie, I see your face and you're trying to figure out how to explain to us what the rules say and how it matters.
That's what I'm figuring out.
Yeah.
I didn't realize you're a mind reader.
I'm guessing.
Putting things in perspective.
Yeah.
Mr. Chi did not need to make any contact with the union until such time as he had gotten the letter. My read of the letter that he has gotten is a clear indication to me that the CEO who wrote that letter was not being properly advised. Simply because the first line in the letter says, putting you on suspension and administrative leave. Which one is he going on? The fact that you're using the word suspension draws clear inference that you intended from the beginning to try and punish. That was coupled with the fact that the Prime Minister said the words that he said on television. We sit here not admitting and not accepting that Mr. Chi did anything wrong. But providing the ministry does what they're supposed to do, Mr. Chi will have his day before the commission and he will not go unrepresented. This is a phone call. It was very wrong of the Prime Minister to look at the public servant and say, you hung up the phone on me, especially in this digital era. The entire public, he has ostracized this officer. He really has ostracized this officer. Because when I read all the comments on Facebook, and Facebook somehow makes Belizean people experts now. Understand me? They're expert in everything.
Yep.
But the reality of the situation is, Mr. Chi deserves his day. And providing they do what they're supposed to do, he's going to have that day.
So the proper course of action should be administrative leave for the purpose of investigation to see if there was in fact an act of misconduct.
Not necessarily. When I put you on any kind of leave in the public service, administrative or suspension, I'm saying you cannot be in the workplace while I investigate this. In my mind, the use of the administrative leave amounts to an abuse. It amounts to an abuse because if this issue surrounds a phone call, please explain to me how Mr. Chi would affect an investigation.
How do you defend something like that? It literally becomes he says, he says. There's a phone call with no log, no recording.
Well, you know what, Marlene, what you're trying to have me do is to put out my commission case. And I am not going to do that.
But
Let me ask you this.
I'm going to simply say this. I'm going to simply say this. He who alleges must prove.
Burden of proof. Let me ask you this quickly, if you'll allow me though. So the call reportedly comes in from the Prime Minister to the public officer, asking for certain things to be done. In this case, to facilitate the importation of these plants. This is in the absence of the process that you outlined from the very beginning, that it goes from the CEO downwards. Could not the public officer have proceeded with facilitating but document the steps that he took in the event that anyone asks, this is the course of action that was taken based on the request made?
No, he should not. I'll preface that with a simple story. Some years ago, we had about 19 Central American presidents coming into Belize. I was the immigration officer at the airport, in charge of the airport. A particular family came off the plane with the Salvadorian president. They had nothing. They had a letter and about 4 or 5 crock of sack with some chattels in there. And I said, well, if you don't have a passport, you don't have a visa, you don't have a return ticket, you don't have per diem for all the days you'll be here, when that flight comes back at 2 o'clock, you will be returning. I proceeded to, I like straying around the airport. A certain minister called me. I'm instructing you. I said, no man, you have this thing all wrong. You don't instruct me, you instruct the minister responsible for immigration. Who shall instruct the CEO or the P.S.U, whomever existed at that time? Who will instruct the director of immigration? The director will then instruct the person in charge of Belize, and then that person will instruct me. What public officers need to learn is that you are not beholden to a minister. I do not say that to say that you're to disrespect any minister. The office of any minister, the Prime Minister, ought to be respected. But you are guided by a public service regulation. And the public service regulation and the functions of your post tells you who your supervisor is. If a minister so desires that we break the law, because that is what it's tantamount to, then put that in writing to my HOD. Public officers are insulated so that ministers do not reach down and cherry pick who they want to do what. That is an epidemic, a disease of all governments. The ministers tend to want to speak to the bottom man. They speak about how bad the public service is. I will boldly say it is ministers and governments who have caused the public service to get the way it is.
Well, you know, I think quite a number of investigations have revealed how there is this direct contact that is made with public service officers when they effectively want to get things done. And I love the example that you use, because I think when we look back, we have always known this to be a problem. And if I reflect on conversations that we've been having with the Public Service Union for a long time as well, is that a part of changing that culture is having a strengthened public service. Your knowledge of the regulations at that time, where you could pat the brakes and say, the way to do it is this, rather than you telling me directly. What is the level of training that our public service officers have, knowledge of the regulations, so that someone like Mr. Chi or any other public servant right now who gets a call from a minister can know exactly how to handle the situation, that they have a strong case to come and say, I did nothing wrong?
Marlene, I'll say to you that training is always of good assistance. And I know that the public service within their clerical training does attempt to try and train. And I know that the union attempts to train by way of seminars. But let me tell you this. It is very, very unfortunate right now. This is not the public service I joined. This is certainly not the public service I joined. The issue of political interference at all levels, hiring, firings, has become a main meal. And even when public servants have been taught the regulations, there's always this innate fear. Fear because some of us have come into the door because of political hirings. So what do you come in with? The obligation to think that if the minister calls you, you have to do something. The obligation to think that if you see or perceive anything to be going wrong, you ought to call the minister and say something. But it will be a wonderful day in Belize when all public servants understand fully we are governed by the Public Service Regulation, the Government Workers Regulation, and whenever you have an issue, your first stop is what does the regulation say about it. Surrounding all of that is the Constitution of Belize. Everybody has a right to due process, and everybody has a right to associate. Nobody can call you into a position to do any unlawful instruction. What the Prime Minister would have requested of that officer amounts to an unlawful instruction, the way it came and what you're asking me to do. Had he wanted a facilitation, as you describe it, put it in writing. Because at the end of the day, when audit comes in and there's no record there to show why that officer took that course of action, who do you think will be on the guillotine?
And that's kind of one of the primary responses that we usually hear from the union, that you expect public officers to be able to ask for documentation for a request. What you mentioned though, Jackie, I think is the fundamental problem across the board. It is the risk of victimization or a perceived risk of victimization. What level of protection will I have if I in fact say to someone who is higher up on the chain of command, they ask me to do something and I say, well, sir, ma'am, please put it in writing for me. I am already feeling that I am putting my job and by extension my livelihood at risk.
Those permanent public officers must understand that it is the Public Service Commission who fires and hires. The persons who may find themselves in a little bit of trepidation would be those who are open vote workers. The issue of victimization is always going to be real. But as a public officer myself, having come from what I refer to as one of the toy department, and I call immigration toy, because both governments, when they want votes, nationality increases. When they want certain things to happen, they tend to want to pick up the phone and call. But as a public officer, one of the first things I learned was learn what your regulation is. Learn what your power is. Listen to me good. Victimization doesn't have color. It's not something I'm going to look in my file and see. Because ministers and sometimes their HOD is very smart not to put certain things in writing. But it can always be inferred by the treatment. For instance, some of the things they used to do with you is they'll put you in an isolation ward. We call it an isolation ward because what they do, they take a desk and put it to the back of the room, and that's where you're going to sit. Nobody wants to give you instructions. At one point, I was in an isolation ward in the public service, but I had fun with it. Because you see, failure to plan on your part doesn't represent an emergency on mine. My regulation said I'm to report to work every day. I reported to work sharp 8 every morning. The fact that you chose not to give me any instruction, that's not my problem. I'm at work and I'm being paid. I'm on a paid vacation at work. When my performance appraisal comes around, and that is the strength of it right there, you know. If public officers understood what performance appraisal meant and the kind of power they had by way of their regulations to say no, especially to unlawful instructions, they would shape up, they would read. I had a case at the commission where it was clear victimization. It's not under this administration, it was under the previous administration. The minister wanted certain things to be done in forestry. The officers followed the instructions of their HOD. But because both the minister and the CEO at the time could not get the officers to facilitate, and also because they wanted to go after the chief forest officer, they decided they would bring 13 charges against these officers. And everyone they won. I defended them, everyone they won. Why? It was clear victimization. It was if you didn't do what I wanted to do to help me to get rid of him, you became a problem. Yeah. And I urged the commission and I urged the Ministry of Public Service with everything in me, when that kind of issue arises, cut it loose. Because the documentation, no matter what happens in this country, public officers needs to know the first line has to be something in writing.
Yeah.
You see, the Prime Minister could have talked all he wants on television. Unless Mr. Che had received something in writing, Mr. Che was not in any trap to be in any kind of punishment.
Let me ask you this. What I'm looking at from an outsider's point of view here is the fact that there exists within the public service a degree, perhaps a great degree of bureaucracy. If you're telling me that these are all the steps that I need to follow to get one simple thing done, then perhaps it's too many red tapes that need to be crossed. Maybe that's one perspective. And the fact that perhaps the Prime Minister himself attempted to circumvent all of these red tapes by going directly to the individual who he believed would have been able to handle the matter on the ground. Would you accept that perhaps to some degree there is bureaucracy that the average person would perhaps try to avoid?
Naturally, anybody who does business will try to avoid, but know this. If you set the law, I am to implement it. The public officer's role is to implement. It's not for the public officer to come and say, listen, no worry about a piece of law when they write this. So come, I want to help you over here. That's not the business of the public officer. So if the Prime Minister thinks that there is, we're not having the business facilitation that we need, that's why he has a cabinet and he has legislation. When he passes the law, we will implement it. So if the law is retarded, we will implement the retardation.
Let me input this also with that same matter. You talk about the bureaucracy, which would have caused delay. The importer was trained, and there's public pictures now showing her in that training of what to do to avoid these types of delays. She didn't do what she was supposed to do. So she's the person who caused any type of interruption, any type of delays. It wasn't the bureaucracy. It was her.
Well,
The country is committed internationally to these agreements. And it's not only in forestry. I come from Labor Department. We sign on to ILO conventions. We are committed to those conventions. As a matter of fact, uniquely, the Ministry of Labor have one of those laws that says any convention that we ratify has the force of law. So to just say that we don't have local legislation.
But there's also, and in most of our legislation, there's also that additional provision that says
The minister may.
The minister may, or on the provision, there's a provision, I can't remember the exact line right now, but it's in most of our laws.
And
Basically, all of these are the rules that we set forward, but the minister can still decide a different course.
And even though the minister may through the HOD. The minister may not through the ordinary public officer.
So they can't jump.
No, they should not be jumping.
They can't or should not?
They should not be jumping. The reality of the situation is, I think the sooner governments realize that public servants are there to fulfill their obligation. Public servants take a lot of beating, you know, especially when people go into vital statistics and immigration and these never-ending lines. I mean, it treats people like cattle. But it's not the fault of the ministry. It's not the fault of the public servants. The reality is, we piecemeal too much in this country. Every time something goes wrong, like when something went wrong with our passport, now an ordinary Belizean have to have about 9 pages filled out before they get their passport. We piecemeal laws. The sooner they do a SWOT analysis of the government itself and determine how we go forward to create a better business environment, the easier services will be to deliver. Belizeans need to start asking themselves a simple question. Why is vital statistics the way it is? Do you think it's the public officers in there? Public officers don't write policy. We don't write laws. We deliver service.
I know there was a video last week, because I do think, and I can imagine you'll say it's demoralized due to resources, but we have seen time and time again where videos surface of inefficiencies in systems that can be prevented. So it's not, I think there's accountability on both parts. It's being able to execute and follow protocols if they exist, and also recognizing that there is a chain of command. While some call it bureaucracy, other people can see it as the potential for checks and balances within our systems.
I think you can enjoy the best of both worlds. I think you can enjoy the best of both worlds. If you write clear policies, government need to stop writing policies at the top and raining them down at the bottom. Until you stand behind a vital statistics counter and truly try to deliver service, you really can't be writing policies. Perhaps the best way for government to go is to start saying, you know what, in each of these departments, I need you to do a retreat, I need you to do so and so, and then give me recommendations on how you think the service could be better, because I'm on the ground. I'm on the ground. And I'm glad you raised the issue of policy. I had another case at the commission, this time from the audit department. One of the charges given to the officer was failure to follow policy. But in all my read, I did not know what the policy was. So when I got to the commission, I said, before I determine what I want to do, can you indicate to me what policy we're referring to? You see, people say there's policy, there's protocol. We like to use these beautiful words.
They can't produce it.
But at the end of the day, can you show it to me in writing? Can you show it to me?
Has it been given to the officers who will execute the policy?
Exactly. You hardly have staff meetings. I bet if you walk in some of these offices and ask whether or not there have been staff meetings, there are meetings at this level, but how much of that is coming down to this level? You only know it. It is unfortunate that we're having a public service that has mutated into a penal community. All we want to do is penalize public officers. That's all we want to do. And that was the need, that was one of the need for this grievance policy.
Well, I'm glad, because I see it as such an important segue to this conversation. While there is, essentially, the union and the ministry are partners in being able to ensure that there is an effective public service in this country. You don't always see eye to eye, and that's understood, and you have your own mechanisms as to how you work. But coming together for this grievance manual, deciding essentially, and you can give me the details, that you both sign off and agree that this is the best course forward for public servants and the ministry. Let's talk about this process. How long has it been in formation?
Well, Sister Willoughby was the person who started penning the manual. From 2014, it was required as part of the regulations when the public service regulation came out in 2014. But as we were talking about how things are delayed, the policies and not put in place, and as far as I would want to understand it, it was the Ministry of Public Service who should have initiated this. But it took the union, through Sister Willoughby, to have started it. The exact year, I guess she could tell you. But
When we wrote you see, Marlene, somehow in Belize we don't like to face truths. No government wants the public service to be better because they need a scapegoat. They've always come in and piecemeal things to suit campaign donors and affluent people at the cost of the public officer, who immediately will be punished rather than complimenting. So when we begin the amendment of the 2014 PSR, which I have to say has amounted to much of a joke. Much of a joke because it created much fuss, and it was at a time that I was going back and forth to school as well. And half of what is in that regulations now, in some instances, is contradictory and an absolute joke.
We're talking about the manual or the regulations?
I'm segueing into that. But one of the things that did get in there was the issue of industrial relations. as Mr. Barber has indicated, we are a member of the ILO, and there are some beautiful conventions that really causes government to create the environment for unions and create the environment for fair treatment of workers, of which we are signatory to. We may not have ratified it and bring it into the force of law in Belize, but we still inferentially has that force of law because of case law that has proven that. So I indicated that I wanted an industrial relations section. And so we have in section 77 and 78 an industrial relations section. But in there I also said, out of that we must produce a manual. So I've been fighting ever since the regulation has been promulgated to try and get this grievance. So I said, you know what, this thing don't happen. If I don't sit down, I'll write it. So I got in my dark room and I wrote the regulations. And I've been pushing it to the public service, pushing it to the public service, pushing it to the public service. Towards the end of the last administration, we did start the work. Well, I presented something to them. But everything takes a year and a day in the public service. You think bureaucracy is only in the delivery of service? Bureaucracy is in getting your simple holiday. So I continue to push and I continue to push. And I'm sure that if Mr. Barber and Mr. Flores would go into the union office and show the amount of minutes that I ensured that it stayed on. And I produced 2 documents. I noticed that they only produced 1 here, but there were 2 documents. The regulation calls for the terms of reference of the committee, of the grievance committee, and then the procedures, the manual itself, what ought to be followed. And when this new administration came in, we continued to ask for it. We continued to say, listen, we need this to be promulgated. And this current administration, the current minister and his CEO said, well, you know what, let's push on it. And this is what we have today.
What is the purpose of it?
So public officers would know how to start their matters. The public service and the commission has found itself in a bottleneck because even HODs seem to have issues in how they read the regulation. The grievance manual is basically to deal with the application of the regulations. Now, let me draw a parallel for you. In section 83 of the current public service regulation, it says, where there's a minor misconduct, these are the things you ought to do. But would you believe it that still about 60% of minor misconduct goes to the commission? Why? Why should it go there? You have a manner in which to deal with it. Take a simple example like absent or late for work. You're late for work, or you're absent, or you're missing work. Your AA or your AO should be saying to you, listen, I'm reviewing your records and this is what I'm seeing. Is there a problem? That's the nurturing part of the public service that we have lost. If you continue, I must warn you that I can take it out of your vacation, I'll take it out of your salary. But they sit back and in most instances do nothing. And then it becomes a disease, a virus. And what do they do then? Instead of dealing with the issue, they determine that they're going to send it off to the commission. So it creates a bottleneck. The grievance manual comes to address things like this.
So it's essentially like a lower level court system.
I don't know if I want to call it a court system.
Well, you don't have to call it court, but it's what we see in our court system.
It's giving the public officer the opportunity to address his concerns in writing to the HOD and giving the ministry the opportunity to solve that issue. And if they can't solve it, then they send it to the public service, and the public service, without the commission, attempts to try and bring some kind of resolve to it. That's what really the manual is doing. And I like, there's a portion of the manual that says, if I write something about you, I should not be victimized. I should not be prejudiced. Beautiful words.
What do you mean, write something about you?
If a public officer writes something, what public officers don't know is that they can write up their HOD, you know. they can write up their HOD. Long before our manual came out, I wrote up my first HOD. I wrote him up.
Basically complain about.
Yes, you're forcing me to do things I'm not supposed to do. You're asking me to do unlawful things. You don't want to put it in writing. That is not my role here. Of course, it saw me being transferred to PG. But I'm a public servant. And my regulation said I'm transferable. No, he didn't put in there that he's transferring me to PG because of that, you know. Because had he done that, I would say also it's a punitive measure. You see? But the reality is...
That happens across the board within the public service.
Well, that's part
It
of
happens
the fear
everywhere.
of victimization that we talk about, because you can be transferred.
Just send somebody to Siberia because they don't comply
But the
with
reality
what you're
is,
asking them to
the
do.
reality is, I say to public officers, no, this is a good example of victimization. And I've said to public officers, what you need to do, if you're being transferred out of the transferred period, there's a process for transfer. From January to March 31st, I'm to be given a recommendation. I intend to transfer you, make yourself ready. The ministry then sends that to the public service, because it's not the ministry who will transfer you. They'll send it to the public service. The public service will probably look at the rotation, probably ask some questions and make the determination whether or not you should go. During this period, if a public officer does not wish to be transferred for whatever reason, because transfer should not create economic hardships, then they're to formally write and say, you know, it's not that I mind being transferred, but this year it is not good. I have 5 children in school, economic this, economic that, transfers to be this, transfers to be that, and they send it in. The Ministry of the Public Service would consider it. So if you are being told in the middle of September, you need to go, unless they say it's the exigency of the service, and tell me what that exigency is. Because in most instances, HODs think they are not supposed to tell you what the exigency is. And if you're sending me for the exigency of the service, in most instances, it is not for 3 years.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying?
It's for an immediate short term.
Exactly. So again, it goes back to the public officer making the public service regulation their best friend.
Yeah. It's knowing the rules that you're governed by and how you can use it effectively. So this brings back the same grievance manual. So let's say I'm transferred in mid-September to Halakte. Is that a matter I would use the grievance procedure for, or would that go directly to the
That would
commission?
be a grievance issue.
Yes.
I wouldn't move. And my advice to public officers, don't move. It becomes an unlawful instruction if it did not happen within the period of time, or it is not an exigency. Don't move. Don't get up and go anywhere. When you transfer me like that, I don't move.
You're being uprooted from perhaps where you have made yourself comfortable, for instance. If you while the job allows you to be transferable, if you are in Belize City, for argument's sake, you have your kids, everybody's going to school, you're invested in Belize City, and it is outside of that particular period during which they're able to make the recommendation and then carry it out, then basically you're being uprooted and placed elsewhere on a whim.
And you're not supposed to be uprooted on a whim. The whole reason we have this transfer process is so that you would go and register your kids in school, you would go and find somewhere to live, you would try to fix the processes that you need to exist in somewhere else. So when you uproot me in the middle of September outside of a posting, then I would have to question, and I look at it very closely. In August, we had some kind of bangarang. I wrote, in accordance with the grievance manual, to ask that this matter be addressed to you, the HOD. And you decide who you, if you come write me.
Yeah.
Here we go on. Somebody needed back a San Benito Pointe, you want to be the one. And September, you move me. Because of the closeness of the occurrences, you can see that it's victimization.
Well, it purports to show cause and effect, right?
You could be wrong, but you have enough proof
Well,
to
if
be
it
able
was
to do it.
exigency, you would have called me in and you would have said, listen, Miss Square got very ill. She will be out for the next 6 months. Do you think you would be able to hold that post for me for the next 6 months?
Yeah.
Because now that becomes an exigency.
Yes.
Yeah.
But you have to
It doesn't
communicate
mean a
with me.
transfer either.
No, it's a posting.
It's a posting. There's another regulation, it says they can post you initially for 3 months and for the maximum 6 months.
Yeah.
So you don't need to have a full transfer.
So I mean, I'm sure that public officers may be watching and having a lot of questions about this. And I want to bring that same question back to you. We speak of policies and how very often they don't trickle down to the people who need to know it the most or understand it the most. How do you ensure with this manual that takes place?
Everybody has a responsibility in the public service. The employer has the obligation to let you know what governs you. A man cannot regulate his behavior if he doesn't know what the law is. The public officer has his regulation, and the public officer must know that within his regulation, there is a section for circulars. They must take the responsibility to find out from their ministry, their supervisor, is there any new circular that I need to know about? Because you also have the obligation to educate yourself. This attitude that some of us have of not looking at the regulation can be detrimental to our causes. You understand what I'm saying? So you could train them 100%. The reality is you have got to take stock in yourself.
To assist in the process also though, it was agreed between the union and the Ministry of Public Service that the document will be sent out electronically to every public officer who have an email with the public service, and that's nearly must be 90% of the public officers. So
how difficult was it to have this agreement made between the ministry and the unions?
Initially, it was a problem. As I said, it started from the previous administration, and with the greatest of respect, I don't like the post of CEO because the post of CEO, in my mind, is a political liaison. I would have been more satisfied if I had seen that the government had created, like Jamaica, executive agents and kept the permanent secretary. Because the CEO has a political duty, which is to his minister, and in most instances to the minister and his constituency. That is where facilitation comes through the CEO. In terms of the public servant, making them accounting officer, in my mind, does not hold well with quote unquote their political purpose. Like you open it for corruption. You have created a fabric for corruption.
I've heard this argument before about the return to the public permanent secretary, which we once had, and then it was shifted to the appointed CEO.
But the permanent secretary, what makes the permanent secretary better is it creates aspiration for the public officer to be able to matriculate all the way up there. So he would often be a person who has come through the public service and understand the administration of the public service. This is what's hurting us in Belize. Most of our CEOs, the CEO who wrote for Mr. Chi, by just the words written on that paper tells me he does not understand the administration of the public service, 1, 2, and it may have appeared, and I'm using the word may very strongly because it could be so or not so, that the administrative officer therein did not advise him. But I'm not going to say that for definite because I know instances where administrative officer advises their CEO
And they still do
and they still do what they want to do. You see, why? Because they are a political liaison.
But let's bring it back though, because I think that the grievance manual is a step in the direction that we want to go in circumventing the challenges that we have persistently seen, where 1, there's political interference, 2, there is also some blame on the public servant part that they don't know their regulations or they don't follow through with how they know they can be protected. And let's not forget the very important group, the public, those who are at the mercy of the level of service that is provided for whatever reason, resources or personal investment in the work that they're doing. So when you look at the grievance manual, do you think this will in any way change or allow for an empowering of the public service in this country?
Let me go back a little. This grievance manual is simply a formalization of what is occurring. Even before this manual, We had a standing facility, started all the way back from when Mr. Gibson, Charles Gibson, was the CEO of the public service. We had a facility that every month we would meet with a list of grievances. So public officers have been writing their grievance. We pray now that what this will do is indeed to empower the officer, to cause the officer to know the kind of powers they have, one, and two, to bring back some respect to the public service. But let me tell you, it will not do it by itself. It will require all parties in the public service to understand their role. Understand me? And to have that merge in a kind of fluent way, and we respect each other. The public servant has been suffering disrespect at the hands of political operations for the longest. I've said to you in the beginning, you want an empowering, you want a change in the public service. Here's how you do it. Take each ministry and have them do a SWOT analysis of what they provide. Cause the stakeholders therein, which are the public servants who deliver the service. Cause the stakeholders therein to tell you how best we can deliver, and stop creating piecemeal laws.
All right. So where can people access the grievance manual? Is it easily accessible? You say it can be emailed out, but just in case they miss my email or spell it wrong.
The Public Service Union have a Facebook page. It will be published on that. For the members, it will also be placed in their respective WhatsApp group, because the different branches have WhatsApp groups, so it should be easily available to all public officers. And if, as I said, you don't even have to be a member of the public service to access the website, the Facebook page, that is.
All right, well, we thank you for coming in and talking at length about some of the issues surrounding public service, and also helping us understand the manual itself and the new process that it entails. Thank you.
Very well.
All right. With that, we're going to go ahead and take a break. When we come back, we are going to be talking to representatives of the Veterinary Association about Animal Health Week. So please stay tuned.